Susan Hendrickson stood in the corner of her cousin's New Year's Eve party wearing a red dress that cost 3 shifts worth of tips, and still looked cheap. Fingers pointed. Whispers hissed behind manicured hands. Still no husband, Susan? What happened to that job you said you'd get? Maybe next year, sweetie. The room sparkled with champagne and cruelty. Susan disappeared into both. Outside, in the cold, she found him leaning against the brick wall. Tattooed, rough-edged, silent. A man the world had already written off. She offered him $100 with shaking hands. Pretend to be my husband, just for tonight. He looked at the crumpled bills, then at her. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. When Moon Park-ho walked into that ballroom beside Susan, he didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't bow. But the room shifted. The laughter quieted. The pointing stopped. Susan didn't know the man she hired had men who feared him. She didn't know his silence wasn't weakness. She didn't know that $100 would buy her protection. And a war. She only knew that for the first time in years, she stopped shrinking. And Moon Park-ho noticed. Susan Hendrickson had been wiping down tables at Marlowe's Bistro for 6 years. And in all that time, no one had ever asked her name twice. She existed in that peculiar space reserved for people who serve, visible only when needed, forgettable the moment the need passed. The lunch rush had just ended. Her feet throbbed in shoes held together by hope and superglue. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, clearing plates still heavy with food that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. A half-eaten filet mignon, truffle fries barely touched, $70 wine left to breathe itself into vinegar. She didn't let herself think about it anymore. Thinking made it worse. Excuse me. A woman's voice, sharp with impatience. We've been waiting for our check for 10 minutes. Susan had delivered it 8 minutes ago. She knew because she'd checked the time, bracing herself for this exact complaint. But she turned with the smile she'd perfected. Apologetic, invisible, safe. Of course, I'll bring it right back. The woman didn't look at her. Susan had learned that most people didn't. Their eyes slid past her face, landed on her uniform, confirmed her unimportance, and moved on. She was a function, not a person. Useful when summoned. Unbearable when she made mistakes. 3 months ago, she'd accidentally spilled water on a businessman's sleeve. Not much, barely a splash. He demanded to see the manager, his voice rising with each word, his finger jabbing the air between them like a weapon. Do you know how much this jacket costs? Do you have any idea? She didn't, but she knew her entire month's rent wouldn't cover it. The manager had apologized profusely to the man, then docked Susan's pay to cover the dry cleaning. She hadn't argued. Arguing required the belief that your words mattered. And Susan had lost that belief somewhere between her 3rd eviction notice and the morning she realized she was 28 years old with nothing to show for it but exhaustion. Poverty wasn't just about lacking money. It was about lacking the right to be treated like your humanity was obvious. People with money could be rude, demanding, careless, and the world bent around them, accommodating, forgiving. People without money had to be perfect, grateful, and invisible. One mistake and you were proof of everything they already suspected about you. Susan had learned to be small, to take up as little space as possible, to never ask for more than what was offered, and even then to hesitate. The evening shift started at 5. By 7, her lower back burned with the kind of pain that no amount of stretching could fix. By 9, she'd stopped noticing it. The body adapted. That was the cruelest thing about survival, how much you could endure without breaking, how the unbearable became routine. Susan. The manager's voice cut through the dining room noise. Table 12 needs water. She was already holding a pitcher. She'd filled it 30 seconds ago. But she nodded, smiled, moved. At 10:30, she clocked out. Her paycheck sat in her bag. $680 for 2 weeks of work. Rent was $750. Utilities another $120. She'd been eating rice and canned beans for 3 weeks straight, and still the numbers didn't add up. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside. December in the city felt personal, like the weather itself wanted to remind you of what you lacked. She pulled her thin coat tighter and started the 40-minute walk home. The subway cost $2.75 each way. She'd learned to save it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her cousin Diane. "You're still coming to New Year's, right? Everyone's asking about you. Wear something nice. It's formal this year." Susan's stomach tightened. She'd been hoping Diane would forget that the invitation, extended 3 months ago in a moment of performative family generosity, would quietly evaporate. But Diane never forgot, because Diane's kindness always came with teeth. The Hendrickson family reunion happened every New Year's Eve, rotating between the homes of whichever relatives had done well that year. This year it was at Diane's, a gleaming townhouse in a neighborhood Susan couldn't afford to walk through without feeling like an intruder. Susan had skipped it twice before. The first time, Diane had called her selfish. The second time, she'd posted on social media about family members who think they're too good for their own blood. The comments had been brutal. Cousins Susan barely knew chimed in with their disappointment, their hurt, their thinly veiled judgment. So this year, Susan had said yes, because saying no required energy she didn't have. But now, staring at that text, she felt the dread settle in her chest like a stone. She knew exactly how it would go. The questions that weren't really questions. The concern that wasn't really concern. "Still working at that restaurant, Susan? Any plans to go back to school? I thought you were looking for something better?" And beneath it all, the unspoken truth they all carried. Susan was the family's proof that hard work wasn't always enough. That sometimes you could do everything right and still end up poor, alone, and powerless. They didn't hate her for it. They pitied her. And pity, Susan had learned, was just cruelty dressed in gentleness. She thought about texting back, making an excuse. Her phone hovered over the keyboard. But then she imagined the aftermath. The group chat messages, the passive-aggressive posts, the phone calls to her mother, who would sigh and ask why Susan always had to make things difficult. She typed back, "I'll be there." The walk home took longer than usual. Her legs felt heavy, like her body knew what her mind was trying to ignore. That in 4 days she'd have to stand in a room full of people who loved her just enough to keep inviting her, and resented her just enough to never let her forget why she didn't belong. By the time she reached her apartment, it was past midnight. The building smelled like mildew and old cigarette smoke. The lock on her door stuck the way it always did. Inside, the radiator clanked and hissed, pretending to produce heat. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. In 4 days, she'd put on the only dress she owned that could pass for formal. She'd smile. She'd endure the questions, the looks, the performance of family love that felt more like an audit of her failures. And when it was over, she'd come back here, to this cold apartment, to this exhausting job, to this life that felt like waiting for permission to exist. Susan lay back on the bed, still in her work uniform, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. She didn't cry. Crying required the belief that things could be different. And Susan had stopped believing that a long time ago. Susan stood outside Diane's townhouse on New Year's Eve with her heart hammering so hard she thought she might vomit. The building looked like something from a magazine. Stone steps leading to double doors with brass handles that gleamed under warm exterior lighting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see movement. Elegant silhouettes holding champagne flutes, laughing, existing in a world that required no apology. She'd spent her last $300 on this moment. $200 for the red dress that still somehow looked cheap. $50 for her hair, done at a beauty school by a student who'd burned her scalp twice. $30 for the cab here because showing up sweaty from the subway felt like admitting defeat before she'd even walked through the door. She had $17 left in her account. Rent was due in 3 days. The mathematics of desperation were simple. You made choices that didn't make sense because all your options were bad, and bad had degrees. Homelessness was worse than hunger. Hunger was worse than humiliation. Humiliation was worse than lying. Susan had gotten good at lying. Not with words. Words could be checked, verified, dismantled. But with omission. With smiles that said everything's fine when asked how she was doing. With vague answers about her job that never mentioned the ache in her feet or the businessman's jacket or the way her manager's eyes glazed over when she spoke. Tonight required a different kind of lie. A bigger one. The kind with a body and a voice and the ability to stand beside her when Diane asked, in front of everyone, why Susan was still alone. She'd thought about it for days, considered making up a boyfriend, someone conveniently out of town, too busy to attend. But Diane would ask for photos, for details, for proof that Susan's life contained something other than failure. No, she needed someone real, someone who could stand in that room and make the questions stop. The cold bit through her thin coat. She checked her phone. 7:48. The party had started at 7:30. She was already late enough to make an entrance, early enough that leaving immediately would be noticed. She was out of time. That's when she saw him. He stood near the corner of the building, just outside the spill of streetlight, smoking. His posture had that particular quality of someone who'd learned to occupy space without asking permission. Tattooed hands. Dark jacket worn enough to have history. Hair pushed back from a face that looked Korean, though Susan couldn't be sure in the dim light. He looked nothing like the men inside that house. Nothing like success or ambition or any of the things her family valued. He looked exactly like someone they would dismiss. Susan's feet moved before her mind caught up. Desperation had its own momentum. "Excuse me." He turned. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just waited. Up close, she could see the tattoos crawled up his neck. Not the trendy kind people got in boutique parlors. These looked older, earned, not chosen. His face was handsome in a way that suggested life hadn't been gentle, and he hadn't asked it to be. "I need to ask you something." Her voice shook. "It's going to sound insane." He took a drag from his cigarette. Still waiting. "I need you to come inside with me, to this party, and pretend to be my husband for a few hours." The words tumbled out. She hadn't planned them, hadn't rehearsed, but now they hung in the cold air between them, and there was no taking them back. He studied her, not the way men usually looked at women, assessing, calculating interest. This was different, clinical, like he was reading something written in a language only he understood. "I'll pay you," Susan continued, her desperation cresting. $100. Cash. Right now. You don't have to say much. Just stand there. Let them see you. Let them think. Her voice cracked. Let them think I'm not completely pathetic. The silence stretched. Susan's hands trembled as she dug into her small purse, pulling out 5 $20 bills. Everything she had left after the dress, the hair, the cab. She held the money out. It shook in her grip. He looked at the bills, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, but something closer to recognition. "Why?" His voice was quiet, accented. Korean, she thought, though his English was perfect. "Because they'll destroy me if I go in there alone." The truth came out raw. "Because I'm tired of being the failure everyone expects. Because I just need one night where I'm not invisible." When you had nothing left to lose, honesty stopped being a choice. It was just what remained when all the protective lies wore thin. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot. "3 rules," he said. Susan blinked. "What? You want me to do this? There are 3 rules." He spoke without urgency, like he had all the time in the world and she had none. 1. You don't ask about my life. Not in there, not after. 2. If someone disrespects you, I handle it my way. You don't interfere. 3. When I say we leave, we leave. No argument. Susan's mind scrambled to process this. He was negotiating. That meant he was considering it. "Okay," she said quickly. "Yes, all of that. Fine." He held out his hand. Not for the money, for a handshake. Moon Park-ho. His grip was firm, calloused. The handshake of someone who'd signed contracts that weren't written down. Susan Hendrickson. He took the $100 and folded it once, sliding it into his jacket pocket without counting it. The gesture made her aware of how little that money meant to him, and how much it had cost her. "The dress," he said, his eyes moving over her not with desire but assessment. "It's good. Don't apologize for it in there." Susan hadn't realized she'd been planning to, but he was right. She'd been constructing the apology in her head. "I know it's not much. I tried my best. It was all I could afford," and he'd seen it on her face. "They will try to make you small," Moon continued, his voice low and certain. That's what people do when they're afraid of what you surviving without them says about their own lives. Let them try. Something about the way he said it. Not comforting, not reassuring, just stating a fact. Steadied something in Susan's chest. He gestured toward the door. After you. Susan turned. Her heart still racing but her hands no longer shaking. She didn't know why this tattooed stranger had agreed. Didn't know why he'd set rules that sounded less like a transaction and more like protection. But when Moon Park-ho placed his hand lightly against her lower back, guiding her toward those gleaming brass doors, Susan felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope. Hope was too fragile, too easily destroyed. This was simpler. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking into that room alone. And that had to be enough. The moment Susan and Moon walked through those brass doors, the conversation didn't stop. It stumbled. Diane spotted them first. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, performing rapid calculations that Susan recognized instantly. Surprise, confusion, suspicion. Then that practiced smile, the one that looked warm from a distance but never reached the eyes. Susan. Diane glided over, champagne in hand. Her emerald dress probably worth more than Susan's entire year of rent. You made it. And you brought. She paused, waiting for Susan to fill the gap, to explain, to justify. My husband, Susan said. The word tasted strange in her mouth. Moon Park-ho. Moon didn't extend his hand for a shake. Didn't smile. He simply looked at Diane with the kind of attention that made people remember they were being assessed. Husband. Diane's voice carried just enough volume to turn heads. Susan, I didn't know you'd gotten married. When did this happen? The question wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in curiosity, designed to expose the lie Susan must be telling. Because how could Susan, poor, struggling, invisible Susan, have a husband without the family knowing? 6 months ago, Moon said before Susan could answer. His voice was quiet but cut through the room's ambient noise with surgical precision. Small ceremony. Susan wanted it private. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he'd been answering questions about their fictional marriage for years. Diane's smile tightened. How romantic. And what do you do, Moon? Import-export. He offered nothing more. The answer was both specific and completely vague, the kind of response that invited no follow-up questions because it suggested the details would be boring. But Diane wasn't deterred. She never was. And you met Susan where? Exactly? At work. Moon's hand settled on Susan's waist. Proprietary but not possessive. She was working. I was hungry. Everything else followed. Susan felt her cousin's eyes dissecting the statement, looking for weak spots, for proof this was performance. But Moon had given her nothing to work with. Every answer was simple, brief, and impossible to disprove without calling Susan a liar to her face. And Diane couldn't do that. Not yet. Not without more evidence. Well, Diane said, her tone shifting to something brighter and more dangerous. Everyone will be thrilled to meet him. Come. Let me introduce you around. The next 20 minutes were brutal. Susan's uncle Marcus, who owned 3 car dealerships, looked Moon up and down like he was assessing trade-in value. Import-export. That's vague. What exactly do you import? Whatever people need, Moon replied. And export. Whatever they don't. Marcus waited for elaboration. Moon offered none. The silence stretched until Marcus, uncomfortable, changed the subject. Susan's Aunt Teresa, dripping in diamonds that caught the chandelier light, took a different approach. Susan, sweetie, you look so thin. Are you eating enough? Marriage is expensive, I know. But you have to take care of yourself. The comment was designed to wound, to remind Susan of her poverty, to suggest Moon couldn't provide, to position Teresa as the concerned family member who noticed Susan's suffering. She eats fine, Moon said. Not defensive. Not angry. Simply correcting a false statement. Teresa blinked. I'm sorry. You suggested Susan doesn't eat enough. She does. You were mistaken. The bluntness of it silenced Teresa. People like her operated in subtext, in implications and suggestions that could be denied if challenged. Moon had dragged her comment into direct light and refused to play the game. Susan felt something shift in her chest. She'd spent years absorbing these small cruelties, letting them slide past without resistance, because resistance required energy and confidence she didn't have. But Moon wasn't absorbing anything. He was deflecting it so casually it looked effortless. Cousin Brandon appeared next, investment banker, married to a woman who looked like she'd been designed by committee to check every conventional beauty box. So Moon, you're Korean, right? Susan always had interesting taste. The comment was racism pretending to be observation. The kind that came wrapped in a smile, deniable if called out. Moon looked at Brandon for a long moment. And you're American. Interesting. Brandon laughed. Uncertain. Well, yeah, obviously. Not obvious, Moon said. I had to ask. The same way you did. The comparison landed like a slap. Brandon's smile froze. His wife touched his arm, a warning to let it go. Susan watched it happen. Each confrontation, each attempt to diminish her or interrogate Moon, met with responses that weren't loud or aggressive but were absolutely immovable. Moon didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He simply refused to accept the premise that he owed anyone an explanation. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The questions stopped coming to Moon. They started coming to Susan. You seem different tonight, her younger cousin Jasmine said, genuine curiosity in her voice. More confident or something. Susan opened her mouth to deflect, to minimize, to make herself small again. She's exactly the same, Moon said quietly beside her. You're just noticing her now. The observation was sharp enough to draw blood. Jasmine flushed, mumbled something about getting more wine, and disappeared into the crowd. Susan turned to Moon. You didn't have to. Rule 2, he reminded her. Someone disrespects you. I handle it my way. She wasn't really. She suggested you weren't worth noticing before. That's disrespect. He said it like it was arithmetic, not opinion. The room had grown louder, the champagne flowing freely. Susan could feel eyes on her, reassessing. The family's collective judgment was recalibrating. They'd come tonight expecting to dissect her failures, to confirm her position at the bottom of the family hierarchy. But Moon's presence had disrupted that equation. Not because he was impressive by their standards. He wasn't wealthy or educated or polished in the ways they valued. But because he acted like their opinions were optional, not mandatory. And watching him, Susan felt something crack open inside her. She'd spent so long believing that respect had to be earned through achievement, through money, through becoming someone other than who she was. But Moon was teaching her a different lesson entirely. Respect wasn't earned. It was insisted upon. When Marcus cornered them again near the dessert table, already drunk and belligerent, he poked Moon's chest with one finger. You know what I think? I think you're not what you say you are. I think Susan paid you to be here because she couldn't show up alone again. The room quieted. This was it, the accusation finally spoken aloud. Moon looked down at the finger on his chest, then up at Marcus's flushed face. You're drunk, Moon said simply. Go sit down. Don't tell me what to. Marcus. Moon's voice didn't rise, but something in it changed. Something cold and absolute. Sit down. Marcus sat, just like that. No argument. No resistance. He sat down in the nearest chair, his mouth still open with whatever he'd been about to say. But the words had evaporated under the weight of Moon's attention. Susan stared. So did everyone else. Moon turned to her. Ready to leave? Rule 3, Susan whispered. Rule 3, he confirmed. She nodded. She was ready. More than ready. As they walked toward the door, Susan's spine straightened. Not because anything about her life had changed. She'd still go home to that cold apartment, still work that exhausting job, still count pennies until they bled. But for tonight, she'd stood in a room full of people who'd spent years making her feel worthless. And she hadn't disappeared. She'd been seen. And that meant something had shifted after all. They almost made it to the door. Leaving so soon? Diane's voice rang out across the room, performatively disappointed. But we haven't even done the toast yet. And I had something special planned for you, Susan. Moon's hand tightened briefly on Susan's waist. A warning. But Susan turned anyway, pulled by years of conditioning that said walking away from family was ruder than enduring their cruelty. Diane stood near the fireplace, her champagne glass raised like a conductor's baton. The room had gone quiet again, that particular silence that meant everyone was waiting for something to happen. Since Susan surprised us all with her secret marriage, Diane continued, her smile sharp as broken glass, I thought we should celebrate properly. Susan, come here. Sweetie. Susan's feet wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed danger. Moon leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. You don't have to go. But Susan was already walking, because this was how it worked. Diane commanded, Susan obeyed. That was the contract she'd signed by being poor, by needing this family more than they needed her, by accepting their invitations knowing the cost. Diane waited until Susan stood beside her, then draped an arm around her shoulders. The gesture looked affectionate, felt like a trap. I want everyone to hear Susan's love story, Diane announced. How you two met, the proposal, the wedding, all the details we missed because she kept it so private. Come on, share with the family. The request was poisoned. Susan could feel it. Diane had spent the last hour probing, testing, looking for inconsistencies. Now she was forcing Susan to construct a detailed lie in front of 40 witnesses, creating dozens of opportunities to expose the truth. Susan opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Don't be shy, Diane pressed, her fingers digging into Susan's shoulder. Start with the proposal. How did Moon ask you to marry him? The room waited. Susan felt sweat prickling her hairline despite the cold that had seeped into her bones. She hadn't prepared for this, hadn't constructed a backstory detailed enough to survive interrogation. He didn't ask, Susan said finally, her voice barely audible. Diane's eyebrows rose. He didn't ask? What does that mean? I mean, Susan's throat closed. She could feel the lie collapsing before she'd even finished building it. It wasn't traditional. We decided together. It wasn't a big production. No ring. Teresa called out from her position near the piano, her voice dripping with false concern. Susan, sweetie, every woman deserves a ring. Susan's left hand was bare. She'd known they'd notice, had prepared a story about getting it resized. But now with everyone staring, the excuse felt flimsy. We prioritized other things, Susan managed. Like what? Brandon asked, grinning now. The alcohol had made everyone bolder. What's more important than showing the world you're committed? Paying rent, Susan said before she could stop herself. The room erupted in laughter. Not kind laughter, the other kind. The kind that confirmed what they'd always suspected about her. Diane's grip on Susan's shoulder tightened to the point of pain. Oh, Susan, always so practical. But seriously, we're all family here. You can tell us the truth. She turned to address the room, her voice carrying that dangerous sweetness again. I think what happened is Susan panicked about coming here alone again, so she hired this man to pretend. That's enough. Moon's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. He'd moved closer without Susan noticing, was now standing 3 feet away. His posture relaxed but his eyes absolutely focused. Excuse me? Diane's smile wavered. I said that's enough. Moon's tone hadn't changed. Still quiet, still controlled. But everyone in the room felt the shift in temperature. Susan answered your question. Now we're leaving. I wasn't finished, Diane said, her voice rising. This is my house, my party, and Susan is my family. I can ask her whatever No. The single word landed with finality. You can't. Diane's face flushed red. Who do you think you are? Coming into my home, disrespecting me. I think I'm the man who's been watching you humiliate my wife for the last 2 hours, Moon said. And I'm done watching. Your wife. Diane laughed, shrill now. Please. Susan couldn't afford a husband. She can barely afford that dress. We all know what this is. And there it was. The accusation, stripped of pretense. Susan felt the shame crash over her in waves. She wanted to run, to disappear, to unmake this entire night. But Moon stepped between her and Diane, blocking Susan from view. What Susan can afford isn't your concern, Moon said. What she chooses to do with her money isn't your concern. Whether she's married or not isn't your concern. The only thing that should concern you is why you spend so much energy making someone you claim to love feel worthless. The room had gone silent again. But this silence was different. Uncomfortable. Because Moon had said aloud what everyone knew but pretended not to notice. "I love Susan." Diane protested, her voice cracking. "We all do. We're trying to help her. She's family." "Love doesn't look like this," Moon said simply. Diane's eyes welled with tears, the practiced kind that came when someone was used to being seen as the victim. "Get out. Both of you. Get out of my house." But before Moon could respond, Uncle Marcus lurched to his feet, drunk and emboldened by Diane's tears. "You heard her. Get the hell out. And take your fake marriage with you." He reached for Susan's arm, his grip meant to drag her toward the door, but his hand never made contact. Moon moved faster than Susan thought possible. One moment Marcus was reaching, the next his wrist was caught in Moon's grip, bent at an angle that made Marcus gasp. "Don't," Moon said quietly, "just that one word." Marcus tried to pull away. Moon's grip didn't budge. "Let him go," Diane screamed. "Someone call the police. He's assaulting." "I'm preventing assault," Moon corrected, his voice still eerily calm. "Your drunk relative tried to put his hands on my wife without permission. I stopped him. That's not assault. That's protection." He released Marcus, who stumbled backward, cradling his wrist. And in that moment, Susan saw something she'd been too overwhelmed to notice before. Moon wasn't just confident. He was completely unafraid. Not in the way people pretend to be brave when they're actually terrified. He genuinely did not fear these people, this situation, the consequences of his actions. That kind of fearlessness didn't come from nowhere. Came from experience. From power. From a life that had taught him his safety didn't depend on other people's approval. "Susan." Moon turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "We're leaving now. Last chance." And Susan, standing there in her cheap red dress with her bare ring finger and her $100 lie exposed for everyone to see, had a choice. She could apologize, could beg Diane's forgiveness, promise to explain, spin some story that would let her family fold her back into their conditional love, could return to her place at the bottom of their hierarchy, grateful for whatever crumbs of belonging they offered. Or she could walk out that door with a stranger whose real name she barely knew, into a night that promised nothing but uncertainty. The mathematics of dignity were simpler than the mathematics of desperation. Sometimes you had to choose being alone over being destroyed. Sometimes walking away was the only form of resistance available. "I'm ready," Susan said. Moon nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the door, not looking back to see if she'd follow. Because that was the thing about dignity, it couldn't be given or guaranteed. Could only be chosen. Susan followed. Behind them, Diane's voice rose in wounded outrage, calling Susan selfish, ungrateful, accusing her of choosing a stranger over family. Cousins joined in, their voices overlapping in a chorus of judgment and disappointment. But Susan kept walking. Her hands were shaking. Her vision was blurring with tears. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. But she kept walking. And when Moon held the door open for her, when the cold night air hit her face and she stepped out of that house into the darkness, Susan realized something that would have sounded absurd an hour ago. This was what freedom felt like. Terrifying, uncertain, completely worth it. The cold bit harder once they were outside, away from the warmth and light of Diane's townhouse. Susan's breath came in visible puffs, her thin coat doing nothing against the January wind. She stood on the sidewalk, trembling, from cold or adrenaline. She couldn't tell. Moon had his phone out, typing something quickly. He'd moved several feet away, his back to her, his voice too low to hear. Susan wrapped her arms around herself and tried to process what had just happened. She'd walked out, left her family standing there with their judgment and their champagne and their certainty that she'd come crawling back with apologies. She couldn't, not after this. But the reality of that decision was starting to settle in her bones. That was her family, the only one she had. Flawed, cruel sometimes, but still hers. And she just burned that bridge so thoroughly there'd be no rebuilding it. "You're shaking." Moon had finished his call and returned to her side. "I'm fine." "You're not." He shrugged out of his jacket and held it out. Susan stared at it. You'll be cold. I've been colder. She took the jacket. It was still warm from his body and smelled like cigarette smoke and something else, cedar maybe or sandalwood. She pulled it tight around her shoulders. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything in there. You didn't have to. Our deal was for me to pretend to be your husband. Moon interrupted. A husband protects his wife. I was fulfilling the contract. The clinical way he said it should have felt cold. But somehow it didn't. There was honesty in it. He wasn't pretending his actions were motivated by affection or chivalry. He'd agreed to play a role and he'd played it completely. Still, Susan said, you were kind. That wasn't part of the deal. Moon looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes unreadable. Kindness costs nothing. People who make you pay for it aren't kind. They're trading. Before Susan could respond, a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Sleek, expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the streetlights. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Korean, young, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Susan's monthly rent. He bowed slightly to Moon, then opened the back door without a word. Susan's confusion must have shown on her face because Moon gestured toward the car. I'll have him take you home. I can. Susan started to say she could take the subway but stopped. It was past 11 on New Year's Eve. The trains would be packed with drunk people, and she was exhausted down to her marrow. Thank you. She started toward the car, then paused. Moon, I never asked. Why did you agree to come with me tonight? You didn't need the $100. It wasn't a question she'd meant to ask, but suddenly she needed to know. Because he was right, he hadn't needed her money. Everything about him, now that she was paying attention, suggested resources she'd been too desperate to notice before. Moon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I lost someone, he said finally. A long time ago. She was in a situation where she needed help, and everyone around her was too afraid to give it. By the time I found out, it was too late. He met Susan's eyes. When you asked me for help tonight, you reminded me of her. I couldn't say no. The honesty in his voice made Susan's chest ache. She wanted to ask more. Who was she? What happened? Are you okay? But she remembered Rule 1. You don't ask about my life. I'm sorry, Susan said instead. For your loss. Moon nodded once, then turned back to his phone. Susan climbed into the Mercedes. The interior was immaculate, leather seats still holding warmth from the heating system. The young driver got back in without speaking, waiting. Where to, miss? He asked in accented English. Susan gave her address, then watched through the window as Moon made another call. His expression dark now that he thought no one was watching. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly. Susan settled into the seat, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. She closed her eyes, trying not to think about what came next. The angry phone calls from her family, the text messages, the isolation. They'd been driving for about 10 minutes when Susan's phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. She pulled it out, expecting family members, but the notifications were from Facebook. Someone had tagged her in multiple posts. Her stomach dropped. The first post was from Diane, timestamped 3 minutes ago. When your cousin brings a fake husband to family dinner and thinks we're too stupid to notice. So disrespectful. Some people will do anything for attention. The post already had 47 likes and 16 comments. The second post was from Brandon. That awkward moment when your cousin's husband doesn't even know basic facts about her. This is what desperation looks like, folks. The third was from Teresa, and it was worse. Someone had taken a photo of Susan and Moon leaving. Susan's face tear-streaked, Moon's hand on her back, and Teresa had captioned it, Susan Hendrickson, everyone, hired a man to avoid embarrassment and caused more. This is what happens when you lie to your family. Praying for her. Each post had been shared multiple times. Susan's phone kept buzzing with notifications as more family members commented, tagged others, added their own observations about Susan's desperation and dishonesty. They were destroying her, publicly, systematically, making sure everyone they knew, friends, extended family, church members, neighbors, saw Susan's humiliation. This was the price of defiance. She'd known it would come, but seeing it happen in real time made her feel sick. The driver's phone rang. He answered in Korean, his voice sharp and urgent. Susan didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Something was wrong. He ended the call and immediately pulled over, his hands tight on the wheel. "Miss," he said, turning to face her. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. The man you were with tonight, Moon Park-ho, did he tell you his full name?" Susan's pulse quickened. "Yes, Moon Park-ho." "Why?" The driver's jaw clenched. "Did he tell you what he does? Who he is?" "Import-export," Susan said, but even as she said it, she knew how inadequate that answer was. "Why? What's going on?" The driver pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. The headline was in Korean, but there was a photo Moon, younger, standing in what looked like a corporate setting, surrounded by men in expensive suits. "Moon Park-ho," the driver said carefully, "is not who you think he is. He hesitated, choosing his words. "He's a very powerful man, and the posts your family just made, tagging him, exposing his face. They've made a very serious mistake." Susan's blood went cold. What kind of mistake? Before the driver could answer, his phone rang again. He answered, listened, then handed the phone to Susan. "He wants to talk to you." Susan took the phone with shaking hands. "Hello, Susan." Moon's voice was calm, but she could hear something beneath it now. Something controlled and dangerous. "I need you to listen carefully. Your family just posted photos of me on social media. Photos that identified me by name and connected me to you. Do you understand what that means?" "No," Susan whispered. "I don't understand any of this." Moon was quiet for a moment. "I stepped away from certain aspects of my life 2 years ago. I made myself invisible to protect myself and the people around me from conflicts I didn't want to continue. Your family just made me visible again. I don't... What are you saying? Who are you?" "I'm someone who has enemies," Moon said simply. "And now those enemies know 2 things they didn't know an hour ago. They know where I am, and they know you matter to me." The words landed like ice water in Susan's veins. "I don't matter to you. We just met. It was a deal, you said so yourself." "I protected you in that house," Moon said. "In front of witnesses. On video that's now on social media. Whether it was real or not doesn't matter. What matters is how it looks. And it looks like you're important to me." Susan's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying without saying. "What kind of enemies?" Moon's laugh was dark. "The kind that don't forgive or forget. The kind that will use anyone close to me as leverage. But I'm not close to you. They don't know that." His voice softened slightly. "Susan, I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. I didn't think your family would do something this reckless. But they did. And now we have to deal with the consequences." "What consequences?" Susan's voice cracked. "What's going to happen?" "Nothing if I handle it quickly. My people are already working on getting those posts taken down." "But Susan," he paused, "you can't go home. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while." "What? Why?" "Because anyone looking for me will start with you. They'll find your address in minutes. And if they think taking you will hurt me or give them leverage, they'll do it." Susan's apartment. Her small, cold, safe apartment. The only place in the world that was entirely hers. And now she couldn't go there. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I'm sending you somewhere secure. Just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." Moon's voice turned harder. "And Susan, your family should take those posts down immediately. Every minute they stay up makes this worse." The call ended. Susan sat in the Mercedes, Moon's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, her phone buzzing with increasingly vicious comments from her family, and tried to understand how one desperate decision had led to this. She'd hired a man to protect her from humiliation. She'd had no idea she'd hired someone who lived in a world where protection meant something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The Mercedes took Susan to a building in a part of the city she'd never been to, where the streets were cleaner, the security was visible, and everything looked like it cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime. The driver pulled into an underground garage, past 2 checkpoints where guards waved them through without question. They rode an elevator to the 15th floor in silence. Susan's phone had finally stopped buzzing. Either her family had run out of vicious things to say, or Moon's people had succeeded in taking the posts down. She didn't check, couldn't bear to look. The apartment the driver led her to was bigger than her entire building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, gleaming hardwood floors, furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines. Everything was pristine, untouched, like no one actually lived here. "Mr. Moon will be here shortly," the driver said, then left before Susan could ask any questions. She stood in the middle of the living room, still wearing Moon's jacket, and tried to process the last 3 hours of her life. She'd gone from invisible waitress to fake wife to potential kidnapping target. The progression felt absurd, impossible, like she'd accidentally walked into someone else's story. Her phone rang. Not a family member this time, Diane's number. Susan almost didn't answer, but some part of her, the part that had spent years trying to maintain connection despite everything, made her pick up. "Susan." Diane's voice was tight, scared in a way Susan had never heard before. "What did you do? Who is that man?" "You called me," Susan said flatly. "What do you want?" "Men came to my house." Diane was speaking quickly, words tumbling over each other. Asian men in expensive suits. They were polite, but, "Susan, they scared the hell out of everyone. They told us to take down every post, every photo, every mention of you or that man. They said if we didn't, there would be consequences." "What kind of consequences? Who are these people?" Susan felt something cold settle in her stomach. Moon's people had moved fast, efficiently, and apparently in a way that had terrified her entire family. "I don't know," Susan said honestly. "I'm figuring it out." "You brought a gangster to my house." Diane's fear was curdling into anger now. "You put all of us in danger because you were too pathetic to show up alone." "No." Susan's voice came out harder than she'd ever heard it. "I showed up. You're the one who couldn't leave it alone. You had to humiliate me one more time. You had to post about it, make sure everyone saw how desperate I was. You did this, Diane. Not me. I was trying to help you see. You were trying to destroy me." Susan interrupted. "You've been trying to destroy me for years. All of you. Every comment about my job, my life, my choices. You've been telling me I'm worthless and then acting hurt when I believe you." Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice shook. "Those men said if anything happens to you, they'll hold us responsible. Susan, please, tell that man to call them off. Tell him we took everything down. Tell him we're sorry." And there it was. The fear Susan had lived with her entire life, now transferred to the people who'd inflicted it on her. They were scared, actually scared, of consequences they couldn't control or negotiate their way out of. Susan should have felt satisfaction, should have felt vindicated. Instead, she just felt tired. "I'll tell him," she said. "But Diane, don't call me again. Don't text. Don't show up at my job. We're done." "Susan." She ended the call. The apartment door opened. Moon walked in, still wearing the same clothes from the party, but something about him looked different. More focused, more dangerous. He had 2 other men with him, both Korean, both carrying themselves with the kind of alertness that suggested violence wasn't theoretical. Moon said something to them in Korean. They nodded and left, positioning themselves outside the door. "Your family took down the posts," Moon said without preamble. "My people retrieved the photos from everyone who'd saved them. The damage is contained." "Your people." Susan's voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Who are your people, Moon? Really?" He moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I told you. Import-export. Don't." Susan surprised herself with the sharpness in her tone. "Don't lie to me. Not after everything that just happened." Moon turned to face her. In the dim lighting of the apartment, his tattoos were more visible, intricate, covering his neck and disappearing under his collar. Not decorative. Historical. "You remember Rule 1? He asked. "You don't ask about my life." "I remember." Susan met his eyes. "But that was before men showed up at my cousin's house and terrified 40 people. Before I couldn't go home because your enemies might use me as leverage. The rules changed, Moon. So tell me the truth." He studied her for a long moment, then moved to pour himself a drink from the bar. "Whiskey, neat. He didn't offer her one. My family has been involved in certain businesses for 3 generations, Moon said carefully. Businesses that operate in spaces where the law is flexible. I was groomed to take over the organization when I was 16. By 25, I was running operations in 4 countries. Susan's mouth went dry. What kind of operations? The kind you don't ask about. Moon took a drink. 2 years ago, I walked away. Not because I wanted to, because staying meant killing people I'd grown up with. There was a split in the organization. Power struggle. I chose not to choose, which meant neither side trusted me anymore. So you just left? I disappeared, Moon corrected. Changed how I looked, where I lived, who I associated with. Made myself irrelevant so both sides would forget about me. He laughed without humor. It was working. Until tonight. Susan sank onto the pristine white couch, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. I ruined your life. No. Moon set down his glass. Your family did. You asked for help. That's not a crime. But if I hadn't, then you would have endured another night of humiliation, and nothing would have changed. Moon crossed to where she sat, crouched down so they were at eye level. Susan, listen to me. What happened tonight isn't your fault. You were drowning and I chose to pull you out. The consequences of that choice are mine to handle. But you said your enemies will come after me, only if they think you matter to me, and I'll make sure they understand you don't. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they felt like a door closing. So what happens now? Susan asked. You make me disappear too? Give me a new name. Send me somewhere your enemies won't find me? Moon shook his head. You go back to your life. I disappear again, more carefully this time. In a few weeks, when nothing happens, when it's clear there's no connection between us, you'll be safe. And you? I'll be what I've always been. Careful. Alone. Alive. Susan looked at this man. This stranger who'd protected her with a ferocity she'd never experienced. Who'd stepped into danger without hesitation. Who was now preparing to vanish from her life as quickly as he'd entered it. What if I don't want that? She heard herself say. Moon's expression didn't change. Want what? To go back. To my life. Susan's voice was shaking but determined. That life was killing me, Moon. Slowly, quietly, but killing me. Tonight you showed me what it feels like to have someone stand beside me instead of behind me or in front of me. I can't go back to being invisible. Susan. I'm not asking you to love me, she interrupted. I'm not even asking you to stay. I'm asking you not to make me go back to a life where I have to apologize for existing. Moon stood, putting distance between them. You don't know what you're asking. My world isn't romantic or exciting. It's dangerous. People die. People disappear. The cost of being close to me is higher than you understand. The cost of being poor is higher than you understand. Susan shot back. Do you know what it's like to work yourself to exhaustion and still not have enough? To be invisible until someone needs something from you? To swallow humiliation every single day because resistance feels impossible? She stood, facing him. You're afraid your enemies will hurt me. I'm afraid of dying slowly in a world that's already decided I don't matter. At least your danger is honest. The silence stretched between them. Moon's jaw was tight. His hands clenched at his sides. If you stay in my orbit, he said finally, everything changes. No more waitressing, too exposed. No more contact with your family, they're a liability now. No more pretending you're just another person trying to survive. You'll be a target. Always. And if I go back, you'll be safe. Poor. Exhausted. Invisible. But safe. Susan thought about her apartment. Her job. The slow grind of days that blurred into years. The careful mathematics of survival that never added up to anything more than survival. I choose the fire, she whispered. Moon's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise she'd seen from him. You don't know what you're choosing. Neither did you when you accepted my $100, Susan said. But you chose anyway, because someone needed help, and you couldn't walk away. She took a step toward him. I need help, Moon. Not with one night. With my whole life. And I'm asking, not because I think you owe me, but because I think we both understand what it costs to survive alone. Moon looked at her for a long time. Susan could see him calculating, assessing, weighing consequences she couldn't begin to imagine. If I say yes, he said slowly, there's no going back. My enemies become yours. My life becomes your life. The danger doesn't end. If you say no, Susan countered, I go back to a different kind of danger, the kind that never ends either. At least your way. I have someone watching my back. Something in Moon's expression shifted. Not softening, he didn't seem capable of soft. But recognition, maybe. Understanding. Rule 4, he said. What? New rule. You chose this. You don't get to regret it later. When it's hard, when you're scared, when you wish you'd walked away. You remember you chose this. Susan nodded. Rule 4. I remember. Moon moved to the window again, pulled out his phone, made a call in Korean. Susan couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was issuing orders, making arrangements, putting things in motion. When he hung up, he turned back to her. Tomorrow we start, he said. New apartment, new identity, new life. Tonight you rest. And you. I make sure the people who need to know understand that you're not leverage. His smile was